Bowness Piers on a busy summer day. Plenty of people enjoying the delights of Windermere. Across the lake from Bowness is Claife Heights, and hidden amongst the trees are a few surprises that those who stay on this side of the lake are totally oblivious of. Now, if that's not a reason to don your walking boots to go and explore, I don't know what is. What lays in wait for us is a ruined building that was built for no other purpose than for people to look out of its windows. A wonderfully spooky ghost story, and of course some super Lake District views. But first we need to get across the lake. Two choices: we can either take the Cross Lake Shuttle from Pier 3, or we can enjoy a very pleasant 1 mile walk to the vehicle ferry. I've opted for the latter. It's a nice easy stroll around Cockshot Point with its views to Belle Isle and our destination Claife Heights. Less than 20 minutes later I'm at the ferry. There's been a ferry here for the last 500 years. In fact, there used to be two. One here and one further down the lake, linking Miller Ground with Belgrange. The modern one's diesel powered and guided by a cable, but up to 200 years ago it was a giant rowing boat capable of carrying not only passengers but also a carriage and horses. In October 1635 disaster struck when the ferry capsized in the middle of the lake. 48 passengers and crew, several horses and the carriages they were pulling were lost. An inquiry into the disaster put the blame on the weather and overcrowding and the fact that most of those lost were returning from a wedding in Hawkshead and were therefore quite inebriated. But some of the locals had different ideas. They felt that it was the work of an evil spirit known locally as the Crier of Claife. I'll tell you a bit more about the Crier of Claife, but I've got a ferry to catch. And besides, we're going to be meeting him later in the walk. Once across the lake, it's a short walk to the first of our surprises in the woods, Claife Station. Pretty much the first guide to the Lake District was that written by Thomas West. It first appeared in 1778 and featured descriptions of viewing stations, viewpoints from which the early visitors could best appreciate the beauty of the landscape. Most viewing stations were little more than outcrops of rock that were easy to get to from the road. But as you can see, this one's a bit more substantial. It was built by the Kerwin family in order to cash in on the Georgian tourist boom, and by the time Queen Victoria came to the throne, it was already a fashionable destination for wealthy tourists. The windows had coloured glass panels to give the impression of the different seasons. It even had its own kitchens and hosted lavish dinner parties. But fashions change, and by the turn of the 20th century it had fallen out of use. It stood derelict for many years and was probably getting to the stage where it was beginning to be unsafe, but the National Trust have set about restoring the building. By walking around the front of the building you can get an idea of the views that those early tourists enjoyed. They would have been able to see Storr's Temple, which was built in 1797 and is dedicated to the 4 British naval heroes of the day: Admirals Duncan, St Vincent, Howe and of course Nelson. Across the lake, the small tree-covered island is called Rampholm. There are mountain views to the northeast, but the view up the lake is spoiled by the trees. Now, not to worry, there were plenty of lake views when we climb into the forest. For the next mile or so the path climbs steadily. Every now and then we are treated to a view between the trees. At the top there's a very pleasant stroll along woodland paths and country tracks. Eventually we reach the open fell, where the views open out a little before we head back into the woods. This path used to be known as the White Post route, and if you notice, the main junction signposts have a white top with a number painted on. Every so often there was a white mark painted on a rock or a tree to guide you through the forest. An ingenious idea with but one fatal flaw. As you can see from this signpost, which is actually number 4. The path to Hawkshead goes in that direction, but you can't see it because they cut down all the trees. And when they went, so did the white mark showing the direction of the path. Luckily, our path is a little bit clearer, and the felling of the trees has opened up the lake views. Close to the sign is a gap in the wall and a narrow path that leads to this rocky viewpoint, featuring this fine aspect of Bowness Bay. And excellent views of the fells to the northeast. It's an excellent place to sit down, relax, have a cup of tea and watch the world go by for a while. Right, tea break over, time to get back to the walk. Here's another hazard of the forest, fallen trees blocking the path. Not just one either. Now, you remember the story of the Crier of Claife and his alleged involvement in the Ferry disaster of 1635. Well, we've reached the Heald, the quarry to which he was banished. So the story goes, about 400 years ago, give or take 100 or so years, a young man cried out on one side of the lake for the ferryman to come and pick him up. So the ferryman set out from Bowness and he rowed across the lake, howling gale, but when he got to the other side there was nobody there. So he rowed back, but when he got back his face was white and paralysed with fear. He couldn't speak. He was taken to a place and he died 3 days later, having been totally unable to tell people what terrible apparition he'd seen on the other side of the lake. And this worried the boatmen because the boatmen were very suspicious people. So they employed a monk, and the monk decided that there was a ghost. They called it the Crier of Claife. And he banished the evil spirit to a quarry on Claife Heights, a place called the Heald. Whether there's any truth in the story or not, of course, is entirely down to your own perception of ghost stories and that kind of thing. But it is true to say that around about the 1800s, in these woods there were moonshiners, that's people who brewed illicit whiskey. And they liked to keep people away from their stills. So basically what they used to do was they'd light their stills, and you can imagine the forest at night with a fire, the sound of the still coming to boil, eerie noises going through the night. And the moonshiners used to like to perpetuate these stories, the ghost stories in these parts, in order to scare everybody away, so when everybody came to look to see what those eerie sounds and strange lights in the woods were all about. It's quite clever. So I thought I saw somebody behind me out of the corner of my eye. I think we'll move on. The young man who was heard crying for the ferry was actually a monk who had fallen in love with a fallen woman who he had been determined to save. But she rejected his advances and plunged him into a depression so deep that he literally cried himself to death. Locals thought that the spirit of the crier had capsized the ferry boat because it was full of merry people returning from a wedding, and some even surmised that members of the wedding party were descendants of the woman that the poor monk had fallen in love with. If the crier does reside here, then he's got a lovely view of Bowness, ideal for keeping a check on what the inhabitants are up to. I think what you can't see on the film, what you only really get when you take the walk for yourself, is the sense of the atmosphere within the forest. It's very quiet. You know, there's barely a sound. In fact, on days when there's not a lot of traffic on the lake, which is only a couple of 100 yards down the slope, you can be up here and the only thing you'll hear is the bird's song. It's beautiful, it really is. We're dropping down towards lake level now and joining this wider track leading downhill to Belgrange. May seem hard to believe, but 500 years ago this was the main road to Hawkshead from Kendal. It ran from the ferry, which is just down there, not the ferry that we know today, but what was known as the Little Boat. The Little Boat ran from Belgrange to Millerground on the eastern shore. The ferryman lived on the western shore, and at Millerground there was a cottage with a bell tower in the gable end. In fact, it's still there. To summon the ferry, you simply rang the bell. And then waited while one man rowed a giant rowing boat for almost a mile across the lake. The current ferry is just a quarter of a distance at just under 500 metres. We're on to the final leg of the walk. At lake level we join this wide track to head back to the ferry. The first mile is through the trees, but for the last mile we leave the trees behind and enjoy views across the lake to Belle Isle. It's the ideal place to linger a while before getting the ferry back to the eastern shore. If you fancy going on this walk, click here for a guided video of the route which you can follow on a smartphone. You'll also be able to download a PDF with a map and route instructions. And we hope that you enjoy taking the walk as much as we did.